I suppose I can introduce myself. My name is Lee. I'm from Switzerland. Not originally, but I've been there about 4 years. I'm Leejo on CPAN, Leejo on GitHub, and leejo.github.io is my website, which has a copy of all the presentations I've given, including this one, so you can get to the slides and the code samples and the abstract. And if you've read the abstract, you will have seen that I recommended strong coffee as a prerequisite to this talk. There's a good reason for that, because OAuth2 can get very complicated, and this is a 20-minute talk, so I'm going to really fly through. So, okay, sorry, let's try. Is that better? Okay. So, the first question I have is there anybody that doesn't have any idea or thinks they haven't encountered OAuth2 in some form? One person. Okay, that's good. So generally when you see that on the web, or when you're using an app on your phone and it says sign in with whatever the application is, that's generally these days that's OAuth. And most services these days are using OAuth2. There is an OAuth1, which I have absolutely no idea about, because having spent the time to implement OAuth2, I have absolutely no desire to implement OAuth1. So when I say done, what do I mean by done? Well, about 2.5, 3 years ago, I started writing a plugin for Mojolicious to implement a OAuth2 server, which is on the side of the GitHubs and the Facebooks and whatever. It's the thing you're logging in with. It's not the thing you're logging in from. And we needed to do that because we have a rental management platform, and we wanted our customers to be able to use an issue management platform, and we wanted to make it easy for them to log in to that platform. We thought to kind of reduce the friction, rather than them having to create an API key in our platform and then copy and paste that into there, which obviously creates problems. We just thought, well, let's have them log in using our system from that system. And to do that, we wanted to use OAuth2, because generally that seems to be the way to do it these days. And when I say it's done, I mean it implements all 4 of the OAuth2 grant flows, which I'll start to cover in the talk. But it's also a base module used by a couple of plugins. So there's a Mojolicious plugin, there's a Dancer2 plugin. I think somebody's working on a Catalyst plugin. But the base module itself can be used you could use it in a command line script or your own bespoke framework. It's not a problem to use it that way. And that was one of my main goals in writing this module, because OAuth2 gets very complicated and you have to read the RFCs, and it's very, very frustrating to implement. So I thought I want it to work out of the box with a config file. That's it. Maybe you call a few methods because of your use case, but it just works. But also you need to be able to obviously override some of those methods, because you want to do things specific to your use case. And as I said, it's used by some plugins, some framework plugins. It's pretty comprehensively tested. And there is some refactoring, because as I say, it started off as a Mojolicious plugin, and then I kind of moved the guts into its own namespace so I could reuse it elsewhere. So there's a little bit of refactoring that needs to happen, but generally it's, as I say, it's done. So it's usable and it works and people are using it. And I've had a couple of people look at it and provide bug reports, and that's been helpful. Needs more eyeballs though, so if you're thinking of using it, it'd be great for you to use it and submit patches to the documentation, to the tests, whatever. So I mentioned the RFCs, and there are quite a few out there. This is the main one, which covers the bulk of OAuth2. It's 76 pages, and it has 29 instances of may, 51 instances of should, and this is a bit of a frustration, because you can kind of understand with the IETF when something grows organically, like the common gateway interface. Okay, the specs are going to be ambiguous because everybody's done their own implementation. But this, they had a committee actually design this thing, and still the spec is it's very ambiguous. So it's a bit of a frustration. And they also released this OAuth2 threat model and security considerations, which is 5 pages short of the main spec itself. So that's something to bear in mind if you do think, oh, I'm going to write my own implementation of this. There's a lot of things to consider. And they also released this documentation, which I have absolutely no idea why it exists. And there's one that's not on there, which is the bearer token handling, which is about 50 pages as well. So there's an awful lot on the IETF to look at. And it took me about, I think, about a week of thrashing through the RFCs and creating these modules before I really got my head around OAuth2. So I mentioned the module itself implements 4 flows, and they are, it's kind of not clear from the way they are named. We have the authorization code grant, implicit grant, resource owner password credentials grant, which you can kind of understand that that uses a password, and then the client credentials grant, okay, that uses some client credentials. And then there's also this 5th flow, which is, this is how much they dedicate to this flow in that 76 pages. It's a single paragraph, so it's kind of like the whatever flow. And I haven't implemented that because it's kind of do what you want to do, which kind of gives you an idea of the ambiguity in some of the spec. So I'm going to cover each of the 4 flows quite quickly to kind of give you an idea of why you would use them and how you would use them and which ones you shouldn't use. So the first one is the authorization code grant, and it's very common. It's generally when you see login with Facebook, login with GitHub, this is what they're using. It's sometimes called 3-legged OAuth, and it has other names as well. And it's generally for the browser. You won't, if you're using an application on your phone, they're generally not using this. Although they can use this, it creates a bit more of a back and forth. So it's not much of it's not a great user experience if you're using this on your phone. It's better for web apps. And it is the most secure flow, which means it's also the most complicated flow, but it's easy with those framework plugins. And the security is through, as you can see, we have a whitelist of known clients and their secrets. And the thing you should do is you should assign secrets to clients. You shouldn't let them set the secret. So you can set a strong passphrase or whatever. And the security is because the client makes a background post to get the token. So that doesn't get into log files, and it's not viewable by the user who is using the flow. And the flow looks something like this. So to clarify some of the terms there, we have the resource owner, which is the person, it's the person using the system. And then we have obviously the user agent is a browser. The client is the website you're coming from, the one that suggests you should log in with Facebook. The authorization server would be the Facebook or the GitHub. We call the resource owner because it's their Facebook account, their GitHub account, whatever, that is the resource that we're trying to access. So as you can see, there's a lot of back and forth going on here. And how we implement that in using the module and the plugins is we define a config that has a list of clients and their client secrets. And then we also kind of have a list of permissions that we can add there. Whenever you've logged in using GitHub or whatever, you often see a list of things the client wants to do. They want to read your email. They want to, if you're using Twitter, they might want to tweet. If it's Facebook, post to your wall. That's kind of what we call scopes in OAuth2. It's basically permissions to do things. And whenever I log in OAuth2, I disable everything apart from they can read my email, because I don't really want them to be able to do anything. It's just a convenience more than anything, not having to create another account on another system. And in the framework here is Dancer 2, so as you can see, just creating that config, we can protect our root at the bottom there by just saying it needs this OAuth scope. So it's kind of a hook there that says, do they have an access token? Does the access token allow them to read posts in this instance? Okay, carry on. Otherwise, it will return some sort of exception there. And how we actually build that up is, you can see here, this is from the point of view of the client, so the thing we're going to Facebook. What we do is we send them our client ID, obviously, and we tell them we want an authorization code. We do a get on that, and what happens is we get an auth code back. And then we use that auth code to do a background post to get an access token. So you can see we've gone one step already, and then we're kind of going back again in the background. And once we have that access token, we can call whatever endpoints we need to do. So that's the most complicated flow, the most difficult to implement, and that's generally all you need to do in your framework, your Mojolicious app, whatever. It's very little code there. So that's the hardest one out of the way already. I mean, I've probably gone way too quick for everybody to get that in their head. And as I said, this is only a short talk, but it's just a short introduction. So the next flow is the implicit grant, which again is very common, but it's generally used by applications you find on your phone. It's kind of similar to the authorization code grant. It's just a little bit simplified, which means it's reasonably secure and it's reasonably simple. And instead of having a list of clients and their client secrets, we have a list of clients and their redirect URIs. Now, obviously, if they're using a redirect URI, it's susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack, perhaps. And because we send the access token back in the foreground to a redirect URI, it can be seen by the user, which means theoretically they could grab that access token and do what they want with it. They could then themselves call your API. So that's something to bear in mind. So the flow itself looks something like that. And as you can see, we've kind of cut off a chunk of the first flow. So we're just basically calling the auth server with our redirect URI, and they're just doing some checking on their side. Is this client known? Is this redirect URI the one that it should be? And then just sending the access token back. And I have an example here in Mojolicious this time, which again, it's just a config, but instead of this time having a client secret, we have a client redirect URI. So again, that is a known value. They can't just decide that they're going to change the redirect URI for whatever reason. It has to match what we have in the config. So we have at least some level of trust there. And again, there's a list of scopes. And to call it, as you can see here, we just basically call the server with client ID, the redirect URI, and tell them that we want an access token. And as you can see, it comes back in a URI fragment there. So it's separated by the hash sign. So it doesn't end up in server logs and things like that. But it still means it's accessible, it's viewable by the user or the user agent. So it's, like I say, it can be reused without your knowledge. So that's the second flow. The third flow is the resource owner password credentials grant. And as the title implies, this is using a password. So it's quite uncommon, and in fact it's discouraged, because the way OAuth2 works is you have a client that speaks to a server, and if you're having to give the client the password to speak to the server, you're kind of defeating the point of OAuth2. You're revealing here's my username, here's my password. So why would you do that? I think this was a mistake that they kind of realized later on, and services that have used this flow have then decided, no, this is a bad idea, and they've kind of deprecated it. So why I implemented this is because I was creating a test system for a service I was integrating with that used this, and then they actually did deprecate it. So I would generally avoid it unless you're in a very private system where you have a very high trust between the client and the server. So maybe it's on a single host and nobody else has access to it. So the flow again is simplified. Basically, you're calling the authorization server with a password from the client. And the example I have here is just a command line script where I am creating an instance of the module, providing a config again, which is a list of clients that we know about and their secret, and then a list of users with their passwords, which is straight away is a massive red flag. So as you can see, I wouldn't advise this one. And here's an example of calling it. We're using the module directly here rather than the plugin. We're saying verify this user with their password. Here's who I am. Here's my secret. And then we just return a token to the command line. And then we can call a script with the username, the password, the client secret. and we get an access token back, which in here is a JWT. Now, what I haven't mentioned so far is that all of the way it works out of the box is it uses a JWT, which is a JSON Web Token, which is a cryptographically signed base64 encoded JSON string. So you don't need to store that anywhere in a database. And that's the reason the module can work out of the box, because it doesn't need something there. It doesn't need a database, a flat file, whatever, to store those tokens. The tokens can go out on the web and come back, and we can check that they're still matching the signature, decode them, use the data in there, and we're happy. Obviously, the concern there is you don't want to put anything that's private or whatever in that token, because it's just a base64 encoded JSON string that has a signature. Anybody can decode it. So again, if you need to do more than that here, you're going to need to override some of the methods in the module. And this is just my client, which is grabbing the access token, verifying it, and then I'm calling it with that access token, and it passes. So again, there's not really much to the client and the server there. They're just calling the methods on the module that I've written, with a bit of sanity checking that is it an error or not. And the final thing is the client credentials grant, which is, again, is also uncommon, because you'll see why when you see the flow diagram at the end. It's generally only for internal services, because it's so simple. You have a client that just calls a server with its secret. So you probably wouldn't use this on anything but a private host. And if you're on a private host, maybe why would you bother using OAuth2? That would be my question, basically. Very trivial, so it seems somewhat over-engineered for this use case. And the example I have here is a CGI.pm based script. Please don't use CGI.pm, but I'm just showing that you can actually use this kind of thing from older frameworks if you really need to. So again, we're just passing a config of clients, known clients and their secrets. And when we actually get the input from the user, we're just getting the client ID and the secret from the query params, calling a method verify client on the server. If everything's good, we return an access token. And then to verify that access token, well, we say, actually, did we not get the client details, but we got an access token? Okay, verify that access token, print what we need to print. So the example here is we have the client ID, their client secret, we get an access token. And then we can again call the server with the access token. It works. So again, just a few lines of code really to get this working. Obviously the caveat here is that I mentioned at the start of the talk is if you want to do more bespoke things, if you do actually want to store those tokens in the database, or you have a specific use case, then you're going to need to override the defaults in the module. And the way that you do that is for all of the particular steps of OAuth2, you can actually pass a callback to the module to fire when it hits that part in the flow. So the example I have here is when you want to store the access token. So maybe you do want to store those JSON Web Tokens in a database, or you want to generate your own access tokens that aren't JSON Web Tokens because you feel they're not secure or whatever. So when the module gets to the store an access token or generate an access token, it will call your callback, and you can just do what you need to do. It passes all the arguments that you might want to check, like the client and whatever, so you can do checks on them. And this is where you need to start looking at the RFCs to understand OAuth2, to understand what they say must happen and what should happen and what may happen. And each one of those steps has maybe half a dozen things you have to do. You have to check, obviously, that the token hasn't expired and the client ID hasn't changed. And you can look at the module's guts itself to see what I am doing, where I've implemented what the RFC states. Or you can kind of look at other implementations to see how they're doing it. And you can override every single step of the flow. So these are obviously not used by all of the different grant types. they're used by the first one because these are all there. But obviously, if you're just using a client credentials grant, you don't need to store an auth code because there is no auth code in that particular flow. So I have all the links to the various modules on CPAN, and the key one here is that I wrote a manual on how to use this because the existing implementations on CPAN they look very comprehensive, but they're completely opaque. You have no idea how to use them, so you have to hack away and get them working, and then if you do that, you maybe end up not doing it quite how it should be done. So I have a very comprehensive manual on there, and there's an awful lot of tests to figure out how to use it. And if you do use it, please give me feedback because I would like to improve this because I spent so much time implementing this. I understand how frustrating it really is to implement it. And there's other examples too. There's a talk and some blog posts by one of the original members of the committee about his frustrations. So if he's frustrated, that speaks volumes. And that's about it. Do we have any questions? Do we have time for questions? Okay. Yeah. 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 And okay, so the question is about expiry times on access tokens from the client perspective. So you're working with a server that just gives you a token that's valid for 30 days, and you're not happy about the fact that you want it to be a short TTL. Yeah, the way, so this was a talk about the server, but obviously there's a client side as well, and there are modules and plugins to do that. And the recommendation about when you're generating an access token is it should have a short TTL. Because the way the very first flow works is you don't just get an access token, you get a refresh token. So at any particular point in time, you can say, right, give me a fresh access token, here's my refresh token. Now, the way it sounds like they're implementing it is they don't want to use refresh tokens, or they don't want people continually saying, give me a new access token. So they've set a somewhat long TTL on the access token. So I would maybe they've implemented it so you can actually set the TTL, or maybe, I don't know, I would speak to them about that and say, look, this is 30 days is a bit too long for our liking. Because, yeah, it's one of the ambiguities in the spec. They say you can set a TTL on the access token, but they don't say what it should be. I generally set it to an hour because it's trivial to just get a new one if it's expired. So it doesn't really. And the JSON web tokens, yeah. So in this particular server, if you wanted to set a different expiry time on the JSON web token, there is an option that you can pass to the config that says I actually want the TTL to be a week rather than an hour, but it defaults to an hour. Any more questions? Yeah, the second one is using, I think it's friendlier in terms of the way the workflow happens because you're not going there twice, basically. So the way the first flow works is you say, give me an auth code. They give you an auth code, and then you say, give me an access token with a background post. Whereas the first one, you say, give me an access token, here's the redirect URI. So it's just a single it's a little simpler to implement if you just have an app on your phone. You just pass the access token out on your redirect URI. You're not having to bounce back, which is going there more than once is always contentious because things fail, and if, as a user experience, it's not great if you're having to go there and go back again. That's generally the way it's advised. Use client credentials for an app. There's also the authorization code for a web. Any more questions? Okay.
What's the relationship of OAuth2?
I think there has been some work on this. I'm not too familiar with OpenID Connect, but one of the suggestions when they were writing the original spec is actually we should get this. There should be some involvement of OpenID spec, and I think that's why they added the extension grants, the fifth one, which is the whatever flow, because what you do is you pass a URI as one of the parameters, and then obviously that just goes off and does its thing. So I think that's what the extension grants is, but they don't really cover it here. They just say, if you want to do something different, you can do something different. So it's a bit ambiguous from that point of view. Anybody else? Yeah. So the question is, would the module help creating client credentials using TLS? I think if you want to use OAuth2, it would make it a bit easier because you don't have to worry about all the minutiae of the RFCs and all that kind of things. Again, this is one of the ambiguities in the spec. They say that servers should use TLS. Now that shouldn't be a should in my view, it should be a must. Because you're passing tokens over the wire, you don't want people accepting that. So if it's not, obviously the module itself doesn't set a restriction on it having to be TLS because the spec says it should, it's not a must. So obviously some people might want to use HTTP, but in the documentation I say really you should be using HTTPS. But if you want to use this to generate tokens from your server, I've done that myself. We're using two flows in our app at work. One thing I didn't mention is we've recently integrated with a third party who are writing an app, and they're using the Implicit grant. So we're using two flows in our app already, and we might start using the client credentials grant when we do internal calls to our API system. So as I say, its feedback so far has been good, and people are using it and responding to it, but it needs more people to use it to find any edge case bugs and things like that, edge case use cases. I might do because it doesn't have too many dependencies. So I was thinking of doing that. I'm working on a project to convert all my CPAN modules to Perl 6. I just haven't got around to this one yet because I only recently finished it, maybe in the last 2 months or so. So there is a lot of code in there because covering all of the guts of the RFC is, yeah, you really have to spend a lot of time with it. Like I said, it took me a week to get through it originally. So yeah, it's good fun. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's correct, basically. It was the cleanest way I could kind of think to do it, because if I start taking, say if you want to store an access token and I have a method to store the access token, I think the cleanest way to do it is just to replace that function entirely, rather than my function trying to figure out, okay, when do I need to call your function? That's get very, very messy, and yeah, you have so many edge case bugs there. So you just basically override my function with your function. Yeah, essentially. Yeah.
much, right?